work with Oakland community organizations and part of the Pico, California network. And yesterday, a group of organizers got an opportunity to meet with a couple of attorneys from public advocates. And we were really thrilled because it's so high leverage to be able to be working in collaboration and really be able to like be in that conversation about these tools and how the implication for really bringing this home to us in our school communities, as you were naming, right, as parents and students. Today we're going to be hearing from John Affeldt from Public Advocates, Dave Sapp from ACLU, and Carrie Hahnel from EdTrust West. And then afterwards we'll be having a conversation just the same way that we just did. So I'm really excited.
Thanks, Katie. So we can't cover everything, but we are trying to focus today on what we thought are some of the biggest questions that folks have. We've developed a list of questions. We can email this around to folks later. We really want to focus on this question of district-wide and school-wide use. That's a big loophole, right, in the proportionality. You have to spend the money generated by low-income EL and foster youth on them. That one provision, and then right after that it says, then you can do that with school-wide and district-wide. So the next sentence it's saying you can spend it on some kids who aren't any of those three things, but there are conditions on it. So we want to talk about that, I'm going to go through a framework of questions that you should be asking your districts when they are proposing a school-wide or district-wide use. And then we're going to go through 3 examples of things we've heard that are out in the field of, one that we think is a clearly no, you can't do that. One that's a clearly yes, you could do that. And, what do you do when your community doesn't want to do that thing that clearly they can't do. And then one that's kind of in the middle. And then Carrie and Dave and I are going to cover those pieces. And then Carrie is going to talk, secondly, about how to identify exactly what is that pot of money, supplemental concentration fund, that the district is supposed to be using to increase or improve services for high-need students. It's a little more technical, so we put that second. It kind of logically goes first, but we're going to give you the framework, and then we're going to figure out how to get to that pot. All right. And I think in that second one comes up some of the questions around how LA might, and maybe San Bernardino, that's news to me, might be manipulating the pot. Mm-hmm. All right. So the first question you should ask, and when a district says we want to do this with our school, is, does the proposed use of funds increase or improve services for high-need students? We're just going to say high need. The statute says unduplicated, whatever the heck that means. Low-income, EL, foster youth, we're going to say high need. But the key thing the statute says you have to do, you get a new pot of money every year. We're growing toward, over 7 or 8 years to a full LCFF pot of implementation, the target. A portion of that increase every year is for supplemental concentration, and it has to be used to increase or improve services. And the regulations that we got in say that means the services need to grow in quality or quantity. And if that doesn't happen, I don't care what else the district says, they can't use their money if they're not increasing or improving services. Secondly, if it does increase or improve services, they're buying new laptops for EL kids. Okay, well that's something new. They didn't do that last year. Does it serve the goals the district has set in its LCAP for high-need student groups? And it could be one of the goals, it could be all 8 of the goals, but it has to, it's not just the general goals, it has to serve the specific goals for high-need students. Very often that may be the same. We want everyone to be proficient on English language arts. But other times it may be different. You know, we want to, you know, more growth for our high need students because there's a bigger gap. So anyway, it has to serve unduplicated pupil goals. Third, if the population of high need students in the district is at or below 55% or at or below 40% of the school. So there are different thresholds in there. But the significance of the threshold is really only one thing. Because even below the threshold, you can use the money for a district or a school-wide. But there's one additional requirement if you're below the 55% district and 40% school, and that is that the district has to show that's the most effective use of the funds if you're below the threshold. So if you as a community come in and say, well, we've got a better, more targeted way to use those funds, prove to us that we're wrong, then they shouldn't be able to use those funds. Fourth, it's not over. If they adopt it this year and say, we're going to do it this way, we don't care, we heard you, we're going to go ahead, we're going to reduce class-wide, class sizes district-wide, we're going to raise teacher salaries district-wide. The fight's not over, because every year there's an annual update where the district has to come back and review progress. That happens for, LCAPs are 3 years, so first year's adoption, years 2 and 3, annual updates. Year 4, new LCAP, new adoption. And so every year there's something going on, either an update or an adoption. When that happens, folks should advocate and go back and say, all right, you said that salary increase was going to improve services. Did it? Did we reduce retention? Did we attract more experienced teachers? Did we change it all? And if they didn't, then and you can also look at outcomes. Did you improve achievement? No, we went down. So that's not a good strategy. Stop using our supplemental concentration money for that salary increase. You got to use base funds for that. You got to take it away. We don't care. Don't use supplemental concentration. And then those are sort of the legal standards to confront the district. There are additional advocacy questions you can ask, even if the district can meet that standard. We propose two here. The first being, what's the effect of this proposed use of funds on high need students compared to non-high need students? So try to do an analysis. Work with some of the folks in this room who can do some data analyses. If you're reducing class size, how many, there are going to be things that are going to disproportionately benefit non-high need kids. Maybe they're paying more salary because they increase salaries. That's going to mostly go in the hill schools where the veterans are in Oakland, not in the flatlands where younger teachers are. So it's like, wait, you're spending more of this money on the wrong, sector of kids. So if you can show that analysis, even if it's legal, you might be able to embarrass the district in the back end from that kind of approach. And lastly, even if what they're doing is a good idea, you could still, try to marshal evidence to come in and say, we got a better, more targeted program. Look, here's the research. Maybe a neighboring district somewhere else did this. Look at the gains there. They got better gains than you're proposing with your thing. You guys are advocates, so I'm just saying don't give up just because they got, legal basis for proceeding that way. Just use all your advocacy tools to build a case for another way to go.
And so what we're going to do is we picked out 3 examples, and I think that there are particular uses of funds that are going to mean a lot of the money, and that we're hearing about, and so we want to focus on those here. So we're going to pick out 3. One of them, I think my position, and John agrees with me on this, and I'm going to give a little disclaimer at the end before I dive into them, is categorically you can't do it. Our position is that you all should be able to argue to a district. If the district proposes doing it, you can't do it. Another is sort of what I call a gray area, a middle ground where, our view is probably generally a district can't do it, but they may actually be able to demonstrate. They may be able to present evidence where they actually can meet the legal standard, although we don't think that they generally will. And then a third is pretty much across the board, districts can do it. And it's going to probably be falling into the advocacy angles to try to persuade them to use funds for other purposes. And what we're going to do is just walk through these questions using those 3 examples, just to kind of show what that analysis would look like. So disclaimer, I think that this represents my view. So I'm speaking, I think that there may be differing views among folks in this room and outside the room. So I just want to put that out there. But I think a lot of us are largely on the same place on a lot of these issues. So the first one is, we've heard structural debt. And I'm going to actually define specifically what I mean by that, which is districts that have taken out loans or otherwise have monthly payments like we have on student loans or mortgages or whatever it would be, that they have to pay, make payments on actual debt. And so that would be basically, we want to take supplemental and concentration money, and we want to use that money to pay off our outstanding debt. And our position is districts cannot make that showing, ever, in any circumstance. And the reason is, question number 1, up above. Does the proposed use of funds increase or improve the services? Paying off debt, definitionally, means you are not using that money to do more or different or better. You are simply taking money to, at best, maintain the existing level of service. And there are other uses of funds that actually will fall into this exact same level of analysis. It's this first question that I think a lot of things that districts might want to do, if it doesn't actually change what's being delivered in the classroom or in the community that the school is doing, they're not going to be able to make that justification. That, we would certainly support folks who want to push back really hard and maybe even potentially file complaints or things like that. So
but Dave, I can't serve my high-need students until I pay that debt down. This is in the service of high-need students. If I pay this debt down first, that's the best use of these funds.
And the standard is that the use of supplemental concentration must increase or improve services in proportion to the increase in funding that the district received. And more importantly, and this is, I think, more of a context point, districts also have a lot of base funding. And as Carrie's going to explain, a lot of the increase in funding that they're actually going to be getting more base funding, which they can use for any purpose. If you want to pay off debt, if you want to do something that maintains the current level of service in a way that you think over the long term is a good idea, we support that. Use your base funding. The middle ground, or what I'm calling the gray area. And the example that I'm going to give is an across-the-board salary increase for teachers. So let's say a district says, we want to give a pay bump to all of our teachers, and we want to use our supplemental concentration to fund that across-the-board salary increase. So I think my take on this is that, as a general matter, that's not permissible. Very much, and I'm going to walk through the questions, very much like the first question, the debt service, generally you're just paying more for the same level of service. That's sort of the general way you would look at it. So the increase or improve is probably going to be an issue. The reason why I think it actually falls into the gray area category is that there may actually be circumstances where a district could demonstrate. And let's, I'm not actually sure of specific facts that exist where this is true, but I think it is possible theoretically. You could imagine it where a district can show we are losing teachers at such high rates. The interruption, actually not being able to fill classrooms with qualified teachers at the start of the year, the high rates of turnover, is actually undermining the quality of instruction available. By increasing salary, we are going to be able to actually recruit and retain and maintain stability in a way that will actually increase the quality of instruction.
For high-need students.
For high-need students. And so, yes, it may also do that for other students, but that they can make that showing. So I'm going to walk through the questions on this. So question 1, does the proposed use of funds increase or improve services for high-need students? The answer is, as I said, as a general matter, I don't think the answer is no. If you're just paying more for the same number of teachers, that's not really increasing or improving. Now, if a district, though, in its local control written plan puts in a showing where it says, we have the following data showing our turnover rates. We did a study, what do you call it, a market assessment analysis of salaries. We actually know that if we were able to increase it by X number of $1,000, we think it'll be able to make some growth over time. That's what I'm saying. I think a district could maybe be able to make that showing. Let's assume that, yes, sir.
Now, you're referring to salaries for teachers that serve high-need students? Or are you talking about salaries in general?
Thank you. That's a great question, and thank you for asking. I meant an across-the-board, so an across-the-board pay scale. This is not a more targeted, specific approach. So let's say, for example, teachers want to increase the salary for teachers with EL credential, with the CLAD, so that they can improve the quality of teaching course for EL students. That's a more targeted salary increase. Now, whether a district will do that, what that means with collective bargaining, it's a whole separate question. But a more specific, targeted increase for certain teachers or in certain schools, what I'm walking through, the example I'm giving is not that. I'm just saying it across the board.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Why doesn't the same argument apply around the, if you think this is a great across-the-board investment for the district, then use your base funds?
Absolutely.
For that.
No, and that argument will apply to pretty much any use of funds. Actually, if it's a question of whether, if we think a more targeted use of funds is better, that argument's always available. You say, no. I mean, even if you meet the legal standard, or especially if it doesn't, be like, no. You still have all this base money. If you really want to do that district, you can still do it. You just can't use this money. The whole point is we're increasing the amount of funding available to use a district to serve the high-need students. There's no justification for using those dollars for this purpose when you have all this other money available. I think that's an argument that applies across the board.
So just in terms of making sure that we're able to get all the questions in, if folks could do the presentations and maybe jot down the questions you have to make sure, to make sure that everybody's able to present, and then we'll absolutely open the space for questions for everyone, for additional questions. Is that okay?
I guess because we just had, I'm from Fresno, and it's Fresno Unified School District. We just had the district that came and did a presentation to our collaborative group of community-based organizations, and they used the term as, well, something about, because we were under the understanding that supplemental concentration has to serve the high-need students. And then the way the person put it to us was, well, almost 92% of the student population meets one of the 3 criteria, so we're going to put it in general fund, which made us really worry on how are we going to follow and make sure that the students, the money is being used in the supplemental concentration specific for the high need students. So that's it.
Yeah, so I think that these standards, as a general matter, just saying we're going to treat this as all the same money, no. These questions, they have to identify in the written plan whether they're spending supplemental concentration on a particular use. For each use identified in a district, I think these questions can apply. So
if they are using supplemental concentration funds for a general district-wide program, we're going to actually talk, our last example is the Fresno expanded learning program. But they can't just take the Fresno, expanded learning proposal and say, oh, that's somewhere in that general funds. In the LCAP, they have to describe, we are using supplemental concentration for expanding learning, and this is why it meets these standards. And they have to articulate.
So, and then just really quickly on this, on the salary, and this is, I'm assuming the district has made the showing about like an analysis of, the economic factors for retention. Does it serve the goals that the district has set in its LCAP? They'd have to explain, that's not that hard in the instructional quality one. I think that would be a fairly easy showing to make, but they have to make it. The third, now if the district is below 55%, I actually don't think a district could ever do an across-the-board salary increase because of question 3. They're going to have to then show that this is the most effective use of those funds to achieve that goal. There's always going to be a more targeted, going to the question of would a more targeted way of using salary or some other use of the funds work. So if they're below the 55% district-wide threshold, I actually don't think they can ever use those funds for across-the-board salaries because the most effective question, they won't be able to answer that yes. And then finally, even assuming that they can answer yes to all these, they've done the market analysis, they still have to then, a year later, 2 years later, well, actually, has this moved us towards the goals we set? Have we actually been able to increase retention and stability? If the answer is no, then I think they need to do something else. So that's sort of how these questions would play out in the final example.
Yeah, so the final example is what we're hearing, comes from Fresno, where the district wants to use most or all of their supplemental concentration money to expand the school day 30 minutes in 20 elementary schools out of 100 or so elementary schools. They haven't picked which ones yet. The question is, can they do that? And, I think folks are in different positions, but some at least would like to say, spend it more broadly impacting than just picking a few schools. And in the district's defense, as I understand it, their plan is to eventually roll it out to every elementary school as they get more and more funding in the coming years. Nonetheless, folks might say, well, 30 minutes a day is not going to help us that much. We really want something else. It's more targeted, extra, teachers or paraprofessionals or for our ELs. So, but can they do it? Well, does the proposed use of funds increase or improve services? It does. It doesn't have to increase or improve services for all high-need students. The district can say, we're just going to do this in some schools, or some high-need students. Maybe they're only going to help ELs. Maybe they're only going to help foster youth. Does it serve the goals? I'm sure they can articulate how expanding learning in certain schools are going to serve goals for unduplicated pupil, achievement and engagement and climate in those schools. So they probably could. And if they're, again, 3 would be, if they're below threshold, that would be your best place to, I guess, try to halt that if you were opposed by saying, that's not the most effective use of those funds, here's a more effective use. But if they're above threshold, then you don't have question number 3, the most effective. And finally, 4 is obviously still available for folks to say, well, you did this, you expanded, did those kids do any better than they were doing before you expanded learning in those schools? Or kids who didn't get the expanded learning intervention are doing elsewhere in the district. And you took away my question, so I guess it's time.
I'm sorry.
It's time for Carrie to...
This is Carrie.
Yeah.
Is this it?
Yeah,
Yes.
I might try to stand up to walk through this. Can we pass this that direction?
Sure.
Thank you.
John, can I ask something?
Yeah.
You mentioned that even on the final example that you gave, you said even if that it passes,
Yeah.
right? How do you advocate the voices of parents, for instance, that are not in agreement? You mentioned that you were going to kind of give us tips on how to do what is
Yeah, so those are the questions 5 and 6 about, try to do an analysis of, they're going to pick 20 schools. So analyze, well, how many non-high-need kids are being benefited by these funds versus high-need kids. And there, on that example, you could go to those 20 schools and say, well, you're helping, 2,000 high-need kids, but there are 50,000 more who aren't getting anything from this proposed use. So here's an alternative use that actually would serve all 50,000 or 52,000 of our kids.
So Carrie's going to go ahead and she's going to walk through the whole thing, and then we'll ask questions at the end just to make sure that everyone has an opportunity.
Thanks. So we just spoke about how we can use the funds. What I'm going to talk about is identifying what those funds are for your district. The regulations that were passed in January as emergency regulations include a calculation that districts have to go through to determine how much money is supplemental and concentration. So one of the important things they decided is that the state is not going to take a role in telling districts how much that is. They're going to pass that responsibility to the districts to calculate themselves. So we think there's a real opportunity for advocates to be watching what districts are doing and making sure those calculations are in keeping with the regulations. As we just discussed, there are ways to game the expenditures. There are ways to kind of manipulate the letter of the law to determine how you spend the money. We're also going to identify there's a way that you can potentially manipulate the calculation itself. So we'll talk through that. This is a 7-step calculation. I'm going to go through each of the 7 steps, and because I'm not an attorney like these folks, I'm a data geek. We also have charts to go with it. So
Awesome.
okay, and actually I'm gonna just show the charts rather than the text to walk through the 7 steps. So here's the first one, it's gonna cover 5, and just to orient you, you're not gonna read left to right, you're gonna kind of bounce around because that's how the calculation works. So first what districts are required to do over here is figure out their target for high need kids. And what that target is, it's if LCFF were fully implemented this year, how much would you have to spend on high need kids? This is the same amount as high need kids are generating. So the state could have said, high need kids get the extra 20% for supplemental, they'll get the extra concentration grant, that's how much you have to spend, and this will just pass through the money. But because LCFF is being phased in over a period of time, I would say the state's sort of giving districts a break and saying, we're going to give you the full implementation period to spend that much money. And until then, we're only going to ask you to spend a portion of it, and that portion is going to be commensurate with the extent to which the governor is funding LCFF. So that's where the calculation comes in. So here is what eventually, when we fully fund LCFF, the district has to spend. What we're going to walk through is how much they actually have to spend this year, which is going to be this $27 million. It's a portion of it. Okay, so they've got their target. They have to establish their baseline. The baseline is how much the district has to grow from. And the regulations say that the baseline has to be at least as much as the district received in economic impact aid in 12-13. So 2 years ago, this sample district, which is a district that's 74% high need, about 35,000 students, you can maybe guess what districts might fit that profile.
Where you can use that for.
It received $12 million in economic impact aid. That's its baseline, and it has to grow from $12 million to $65 million over the phase-in period. Step 3 is to calculate what I'm going to call the equity gap. The regulations don't call it that, but I think it's a nice way to label it. It's the difference between the two. And in this case, that gap is $53 million. So the district has to close a $53 million gap over roughly 7 years until we fully implement LCFF. Okay? That's step 3. And then step 4 is where we figure out how much of that gap the district has to close this year. And the percentage is, it has to correspond directly with how much the governor is funding LCFF this year. Luckily, the state is planning to close a lot of the LCFF gap this year, 28%. So what we do in this case is we multiply the gap, the 53%, times that 28%. If there is an economic downturn and Prop 98 doesn't grow and there isn't a big increase in LCFF, the spending on equity would essentially stay flat. But in this case, we're seeing a really big bump at 14-15. And so when we multiply the 53 million times the 28%, we get to 15 million. That's the additional amount that the district has to spend on high need kids this year, on top of a maintenance of effort. So it still has to spend what it used to spend on economic impact aid, but it also has to spend another $15 million, and it has to show in its LCAP that it's doing that. Okay, so here's where the gamesmanship comes in. Most districts we're hearing are just going to use EIA as their baseline. Like, why would we want to put more in there? We want to keep our obligations small. On the other hand, we're hearing that some other districts, I think LUSD is a really good example, wants to make that baseline really big. And they are considering throwing in things like class size reduction and other programs that they claim in the past have benefited unduplicated pupils. And what happens when they make that number really big is this commitment becomes really big. But that also allows them to turn around into their LCAP and using the example that these guys show, say, okay, and we're going to use that big pot of money to do class size reduction. So they're essentially saying we did it before, we're going to do it again, and therefore meet our obligation. And there's always going to be a little bit of an increase because they have to ramp up over time, so they still have to increase or improve services, but it decreases the amount by which they have to increase or improve in any given year. So
it decreases the gap.
It decreases the gap, and therefore it decreases the amount of new stuff they have to do. The other strategy that you can imagine playing out is the district might say, if we make this amount really big, the rest of the money that's base money is going to be smaller, and that's less money to be open to collective bargaining. So it could be a strategy for keeping more money controlled by the district. Okay, so that brings us to, okay, we got through step 5, the minimum spending, and then the next slide we'll look at step 6 and 7. Once we get our $27 million, which is the amount the district has to spend, They take that away from their total entitlement for this year, and the rest is their base spending. So I think Dave mentioned that the district gets a lot of base money, and you can see that the vast majority of its funding is base funding. In fact, the additional amount for each high-need kid is 10%. So if a non-needy kid gets $1, a high-need kid gets $1.10 in this instance. So there's plenty of money here, in my opinion, for things like across the board salary increases. There should be very little need for a district to encroach upon its supplemental and concentration funds in order to fund salary increases.
Carrie, just the 258 plus 27, that total 280 something. Is that new LCFF money this year to this district, or is that its total funding?
That's its total funding. Actually, if you click over the next slide,
Yeah.
I can grab a number and then we'll go back.
Yeah, here.
So that this district there's a lot on here. I wasn't planning on covering this, but the district used to get 249, and in 14-15 it was getting 285. So it's a total increase over that time period of $36 million. So on one hand, the district could say, if you go back to where we were, well, it's really hard to spend $27 million this year because our total increase is only 30-something million. But the truth is, we're not asking districts to just look at the new money. We're asking them to reconsider the total pot of state funding. And that's really important. It's not just what portion of new funding is for high-need kids, it's what portion of money, period, is for high-need kids.
And sorry, the math ends up coming to 40% of the new money that they get is supplemental and concentration money. 60% is new base money if you compare it to the baseline.
Correct.
So actually, a lot of the new money is money that they have complete flexibility with. So that's another way of also looking at it.
Yeah, I mean, you can see that the base funding actually ramps up faster in terms of total dollar amount than the supplemental concentration. So in giving the districts a break during phase-in, they actually gave them a break for supplemental concentration funding. They gave them an advantage for base funding. So that's another way to think about it. So what you can see on the top, this is the proportionality. That's step 7. The district has to calculate the percentage of additional funding that each high-need student generates. And that's the spending in the LCAP that these two gentlemen described has to be commensurate with that percentage. They have to show there's going to be 10% more to increase or improve services for high-need kids this year.
They also have to identify the particular dollar amount. In the template at 3C, you have to say it's 27 million. For next year, 40 million. So you can go and see the actual dollar amount as well as the percent.
Okay, so and all this chart shows is what the phase-in might look like for this district, assuming that full implementation is reached in 2020. And what you see is that the percentage that supplemental and concentration grows even as the dollar amount grows over time. So I'll leave it at that, and we can take questions.
Thank you, that was great.
There's one question from an earlier panel, or from the earlier panel that I thought was also relevant here. So
Do you want to name it and then respond?
well, so there was one question about sort of what happens about the budget. The districts are saying, "Oh, we don't know if the money's guaranteed." That question. So I assume they're saying, "Well, we're not going to commit to do anything because we don't know the money's guaranteed." I mean, I assume that's kind of the context for it. Can you address that in light of sort of what the it's true we don't know what the budget will be year to year. I mean, never do that. And that's always been the case.
Well, that's always the case. The numbers that are in here are the projections from the Department of Finance for the next 3 years. So I know that the LAO and the Department of Finance feel like these are pretty solid estimates, but I know that other advocacy groups like school services are advising caution and saying, expect less than this and build a reserve, and if you get the money, that's great, but they're advising them not to wrap up too much funding in ongoing obligations in the event that there is an economic downturn that we don't predict.
And if your district moves in that direction, I think the strategy is to say, we hear you that you're gonna be conservative. What's your plan B when the money comes in? You can talk about how you'd spend the additional money if dollars came in, within the context of the plan or an appendix or something. But I get why they're being conservative because of the dips and ups and downs we see in the budget. But, you know, a 2-year out forecast, certainly that's a little bit more solid than obviously an 8-year out forecast.
And just to add to that just really quickly, my view, and I'm speaking for myself here, is to just say no as far as what that means for supplemental concentration.
Right.
If districts want to build their reserves, they have plenty. They can put base dollars in there. The uncertainty about what might happen next year has no bearing, purely from a legal analysis standpoint, in my view, on whether they've met the standards for the current year LCAP. So they have to increase or improve services proportional to the increase in funding they receive. So, you know, just because they don't know how much money they might get next year doesn't mean that they don't have to spend that $27 million to increase or improve services for those high need students this year. So I think that's also, you know, it's very closely related to what Sam was saying about what are you going to do when the money comes in. I think that's absolutely the correct question. But sticking money into a reserve account is not increasing or improve services. Going back to the question 1, does it increase or improve services? If they're going to list supplemental concentration, we're holding it in reserve. I would certainly advocate and support and help folks saying, sorry, you can't do that, because that's not increasing or improving.
I would agree with that. And the other thing I would add is that it may mean the district, on one hand, doesn't want to tie up money into salary increases that are going to be sort of permanent, which could be a good thing. It may also mean that you need to adjust your advocacy to think about targeted things for high need kids that aren't also not necessarily permanent. You know, we're going to try this extra counselor program for 2 or 3 years, and then we'll reevaluate that time. You can kind of frame your advocacy of it. The other thing from the earlier panel I want to make sure we address is the LA example, as we understand it. And I think it might be what's going on in San Bernardino as well, that the district come in and say, we don't have an increase. We don't have any LCFF money to spend on you this year because of the state budget, or, you know. It's like, that's impossible, I think, in a district as big as LA or San Bernardino with that many high-need kids. They have an increase. I mean, to go back to the slide, there it is. There's some money there, and you got to tell us how you're going to spend it to increase or improve services. Now, as I understand how LA is gaming it, they are building up their baseline. Using the example from the prior slide, their supplemental concentration baseline by saying, well, we're going to count not just EIA, we're going to say the money we're spending on adult ed, that was really serving, high need kids. Oh, and all the money we've been spending on early ed, well, that's really, we're doing that to help high need kids. There's a third.
Class size reduction.
Class size reduction.
Yeah.
We didn't make the cuts. We kept those programs in place for you guys, for your communities, and so those are really for high need kids, and therefore our gap is almost. I mean, we're already spending, at our target level, so we don't really have to add very much, if anything. So I think the flaw with that is that. Looking at the regulations in particular, the baseline definition has to be in addition to what was expended on services provided for all pupils. And they were providing those services, adult ed, early ed, even if those qualify because those aren't K-12, but assume that was a general program for all pupils. Now, it may be that unduplicated or high need kids took most advantage of it, but it was not a targeted service the way EIA was. So I think they are legally wrong to try to include those funds in their baseline.
Yeah.
Val.
So,
Moderate.
and I know we have like 18 minutes, is that right? I'm not sure about We have 3 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay.
We've answered a lot of questions during the presentation.
We did. That, and obviously, like, we're all thirsty for this, because for the folks that are on the ground, these tools are really powerful. I think there are a couple of things that emerged. One is just in terms of the accessibility of this information for us, and for it being targeted, so that folks around the room are able to, access the information easily, because it is so incredibly useful. The second question is really looking at what the legal levers are in terms of making a connection between the LCAP development process and the parent engagement requirement and the budget development. So I know a lot of us on the ground are, in conversations and part of LCAP development, but at the end of the day, we're dealing with the kind of situations that you were describing, where we're being told, oh, this is being used, and you're being listened to, and we're engaging you, but it's not really responsive, so to what the community is saying we need. So in terms of thinking about some of those tools, and then opening it up to the group, so maybe.
So I mean, I have one question. Is more just what would be helpful, right? Is it, we could develop, for example, a form letter, draft letter. If you hear your district is talking about using a fund, for some of the things that we think are just categorically not permissible, so that we could work directly with organization. We could just create a template, you just fill it out and send it in, or figure out some strategy for doing that. Developing talking points on some particular uses. I mean, those are the sorts of things maybe as far as, operationally when this stuff starts coming. I know one challenge that I've experienced is that it's not in writing from districts yet. A lot of this because it's meetings, we're hearing stuff, we haven't seen anything. So I'm a little hesitant unless I see it in writing from a district, like fire off a letter. But so that's sort of one. Would that be helpful? Like just figuring out sort of like a process for it, maybe.
I have some suggestions as well. We worked really hard, and we took a lot of the questions. Remember when we advocated on the emergency regulations. So these guiding questions that are in the LCAP template on the emergency regs, I think some districts will be able to meet them easily, but some of them will not, and I think you'll find that they are useful in saying you didn't do these things. The other thing I like to point out to folks is that there are two different things in the LCAP statute around engagement and involvement. There's the parental involvement priority, and the template says that is different than the engagement, stakeholder engagement. So don't let them lump the two together. And that the priority really focuses on how you're involved in the programs for those students. Things like teacher-to-parent visit program or parent-teacher academy at schools, that kind of thing, as opposed to just having you come to a board meeting or be on a school site council.
So did folks have thoughts on, Roberta, wait,
Yeah, it is. I think it is. I mean, in terms of what we could use, it seems like two things. One, I think this is beautiful, right? And I think the examples you gave are beautiful. And it would be hard for us to individually calculate these numbers. So for partners that are calculating, that would be really incredible information for us to have. And then I also wonder for on the legal side, is it a reasonable question? It seems like to say to every district, what is your baseline and how did you calculate it, right? And then we can turn to you all and say, well, they calculated it with these 7 categorical programs. Does that make sense? What are the next questions we should be asking after they say, here's their baseline and what they include?
The only thing I would caution folks is when you ask them the question, don't lead. Like have them, hopefully they'll say we used EIA and then you're done. But if they say the 10 other things, then it's time to focus and advocate, because I don't think all districts are caught on to this dynamic.
No,
and I don't want them to.
I spoke with a CFO yesterday who said, well, we're using EIA. that's what we're supposed to use.
At another district, not at LA.
Not in LA, a different district.
Yeah, like as
So I
much
think
don't
the Sapp
advocate
here
for
will
it.
answer.
Right. So Val, and I'm wondering if there are other folks who also want to share, like, here's something that would be really useful.
Just two quick things. So when I hear school board members talking about it in some districts, they're being advised by cabinet members, as I think what you're saying, which we are already doing so much of this.
Yes.
So we should be able to calculate that into increase and improve services for our students. And I'm trying to figure out.
That's not increase or improve.
Yeah. So
That's maintaining.
that's maintaining.
Where you
And
would
so
do
that's,
it.
I think, a caution for lots of folks is to the extent that most districts, I think, are going to want to just simply
Yeah.
keep thinking of the funding in the same way they used to get it and what it paid for. The other thing is transparency. I haven't seen a district yet even explain this to folks, or even, okay, wonderful, there's an example. And I'm wondering, to what extent will districts even share these calculations with communities, and what can you, and this is the transparency piece that we were fighting for at the state board around money.
I mean, one is, I would expect that maybe this should go into the best practices material on the wet engagement. At a minimum, this information should be shared with the PAC and the DLAC as an explanation when the draft LCAP template is presented to them for comment. To those, a lot of this turns on who are the members of those bodies, and and then those bodies can actually submit questions that have to be responded to in writing. So if we have one or two people, or at least one person on one of those bodies that is willing to ask those questions, the district will have to respond in writing and provide it. Show us exactly what was the calculation amount and what was counted. I believe the district would actually have to provide that information
So
to the
can that
PAC.
be a form letter that we know
Yeah,
we're
that's
already
what I was
going to
about
need?
to say. Yeah, the request for information about the data on that calculation, because that's, I know in our own district we've made numerous voluminous Mark Tapoya information requests, and they haven't been responded to. So I think having something where it's very simple and where it's very clear and transparent that this is actually being used across the state will help us lever our individual districts. I think it would be a very powerful tool. Anybody else? Oh,
Well, I was going to say, virtually every district is using a calculator to do this. That's
Right.
provided by FCMAT and the county superintendent, Secessa. I can't even remember every letter.
Called the Basque.
Some of the BAS calculator, it's an Excel sheet. Some districts are very gracious in just sharing that, and you can see right there what their assumptions are. So just know that that's their primary tool for calculating this. It's called the BAS or FCMAT calculator.
FCMAT is the Fiscal Crisis Management and
Assistance
Team.
Team.
And BAS.
There's one other, the school services calculator, but I've found that most are using the BAS calculator. The other thing is that we are updating the Fair Share for Kids website that Val maintains with this data for every district. I am working with a few districts, including LA right now, to refine some of the data so that it matches more closely with what they had, but we'll have that up hopefully next week.
Yeah.
And that's just
That's gonna
assuming
be
EIA
awesome.
is the base, right? Carrie,
Yeah.
that's assuming EIA is the base?
We're assuming EIA is the base. If we make adjustments for any district based on their request, we'll include research notes to that effect.
that means that you've actually, for sure, here's what they're using at their base, as their base instead of.
If we know that, otherwise we'll use EIA.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have more of a basic question as to when the districts get their money, because I know that for some of the committees, they've requested, the budgets for the DLAC they only have 4 meetings, right? And they've requested the budget from the first meeting. Yesterday they held the third meeting, LAUSD, and they still don't have it. So it's a request in every public, minutes.
This year,
And the district,
they
they
should
worry
know.
about the plan, not
Well,
the
you should
budget.
keep asking, but this year we are in a little bit of transition, so, but you shouldn't let them use that as an excuse not to give you the data generally. They're trying to get down to the cent level, like, we won't know that honestly until July, in terms of, even last year's funding, so we have some data issues at the state level that have been long-standing, right? So, but don't let them use that as a way to say, well, we can't talk about budget numbers, because they have a general sense, they're having to do their budgets now anyways, even on not having precise
So then if
information.
they don't get it, then public request would be necessary in order to get that budget, or?
It shouldn't have to be in terms of what good engagement should be. They should be
Right.
posting that information publicly, but
Right.
if they aren't, yeah, I
Right.
think that's.
And oftentimes, even if they are, it's like you can't really understand it because the budgets are so difficult to understand.
So I just wanted to lift up, I was like, so we have been, when I worked at Coleman Advocates, this was one of our touchiest issues with the district because there's multiple pots of money that comes in San Francisco, way more than any other district in this state. And so Pina just came from their board meeting, so I would actually lift up that this is probably the only district that does that calculation publicly. So Pina has an electronic version of it, and so I think that there are lessons that we've learned over the years as far as budget advocacy and supporting internally a district to understand what's actually, you want to say?
Oh, sure.
Actually, to the whole group, I'll
Yeah.
email it right now. The presentation that was given.
And one of the things we learned over this last 2 years with what we had to code for them was putting the numbers out. It's scary. Like, just acknowledge it. Like, it is scary because you don't want this green-eyed storm to kind of be like, we want money. Like, everyone, that is basically their internal fear. And it took 4 years to get them to a place of, like, just state the fear, you know? But once again, like, San Francisco can be a model for what we, you know, and we've gone year to year to year. Like, just tell us what the money was year to year to year. Can you just make that a chart? Can you just say what was ADA, what was this, how you spent the money? Can you do a basic balance sheet that parents and students can understand? So those are all protocols and pieces that, like, even just something that you all can look at this PowerPoint and understand from San Francisco's perspective how transparency can be achieved.
So, I'm not sure, Val, are we at time?
We're going into lunchtime, so there's a lot of us to feed, so we probably should break for lunch.
But lunch
Okay.
is being set up yet, so maybe we can take a few lunch.
Yeah, well, when they're done, then we'll use that as our cue.
Okay,
Good idea.
great. So with that, Patrice?
So my question has more to do with the annual updates, because my concern is even for the districts that are, for our most ideal districts that are using supplementary and concentration dollars to increase and improve services, right? What if year to year they're not really meeting that target because of maybe the way that they've implemented their programs or their services, or the way that in which they've increased services are still not really making significant improvements, but yet you know, it may come down to a situation of how those programs are actually being evaluated to show where the challenges are, as to how or as to why improvements are not being made. So how then do we inform the advocacy community, or what are the questions that they should ask in reference to that?
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it is a gray area. There's not a lot of guidance on it. But you know, we propose the questions here of, you know, it's really two, like, in number 4 there, 2 ways to get at it. Like, was there an actual increase or improvement? So if they, you know, brought in more tutoring for EL students, you know, even if it didn't increase their achievement, you have to say, well, you know, they did increase services, and then they can continue to do that if they want, but you're arguing maybe that's not a good use, because look, we've been doing this for 4 years and nothing's changed, let's do something else. But that's kind of an advocacy point. That,
Well, even if they, implement something new, and
Yes.
then the way that may be implemented still has some kinks to it that we're not. So my thing is, how do we match the funding that they're getting to the investments that they want to make, but ensure that there's a track toward progress, but being realistic that progress may or may not come within that year time, within that second year time.
yeah, and I think that's fair. You know, on the salary increase, like, I think even if, hey, they didn't improve retention in year 1, year 2, it's still a little early. So, you know, it's just kind of a reasonableness test at that point. Other programs, you would expect to see improvements quicker. And, you know, it's just within, I mean, people are advocates. You kind of, make your best arguments
Well,
that
so-
are within reason.
And can I also say, you're lifting up the big public policy question that we collectively need to wrestle in the state, and push really hard, because we are in this transition around our outcome accountability system, and it's absolutely the state role to figure out, how we set the stage and make sure that kids are making progress. So I don't think within the context of the existing legal structure, the statute structure, we have it all yet, and we need to collectively build pressure for that. Because that's the next big piece.
Yeah, my fear is that we don't want our community members to get frustrated, because they're already frustrated.
Right.
Ms. Deborah said here, she's already jaded. Well, we have a lot of community members that have been in it for so long, and we do see this as a tool and as an opportunity, but as they're being engaged year to year and may not necessarily see the progress, it may not necessarily be because districts are maneuvering to do, all this other sneaky stuff, but it may just very well be that the implementation process is a struggle for the district themselves. So how do we
this whole thing is, flying the plane while we're building it.
Right.
So the piece that's getting built is the accountability system. Sam says we don't have it now. October 2015, the state board has to adopt evaluation metrics by which districts will be judged. Did you make enough progress with your LCAP and your goals? And if not, what are the standards for picking the districts to intervene on and give them technical assistance and ultimately possibly interventions from the state. So that hasn't actually been figured out yet. And at the same time, we're redoing the API, right? How we rank schools, and that's becoming more inclusive thanks to Steinberg bill. It's going to have more factors in it, not just test scores. So all of that is being built.
If I can offer up, though, as a proactive tack that community-based organizations can take, is that with a lot of the strategies that districts will be pursuing, there tend to be at least an introductory quality assessment tool that's out there for the type of programming or the strategy being embarked upon. And so for community-based organizations to get their hands on this tool and play an active role in that ongoing evaluation, rather than just deferring to that yearly gathering of folks, allows for that to be an ongoing dialogue rather than to just be a report out, lack of a better word, excuse my language, a bitch fest on all fronts. Right. For it to be an ongoing dialogue throughout that process.